Did you know that in Japan, it is rude and forbidden to talk on the cell phone and stare at people on the subway? In Japanese subways, there are special sections for the elderly, pregnant women, and disabled people, which people other than this group do not have the right to sit on. On the other hand, there is no obligation to give seats to the elderly in other parts of the metro. And the first person who enters the elevator should stand next to the buttons and hold the door for others to enter. And do this quickly and accurately in every floor. He should also be the last person to leave the elevator, unlike most parts of the world, which consider snorting and eating loudly as a bad thing. The Japanese consider this act as a sign of respect and enjoyment of food. And it is not considered impolite at all. Also, if your food is served in a bowl, you can hold the bowl near your mouth. Another occasion in which the Japanese should give gifts is after returning from a trip, which is considered a kind of souvenir. After a Japanese returns from a trip, he is expected to give gifts to his family, friends, and colleagues. One should bring delicious food to the travel destination for relatives. In addition, opening gifts in the presence of the person giving the gift is not nice at all, and they should open the gifts after the person leaves. According to Shinto, if a person makes a mistake, there is no external punishment, and the only thing that can punish a Japanese person more than anything else is the torment of conscience and the shame of the mistake that the person made. This is considered the biggest punishment for a Japanese person, and may lead them to commit suicide.
The samurai warrior of feudal Japan has been a pop culture staple for decades. Brave, disciplined, skillful, and above all, honorable samurai have appeared as the heroes of beloved films, novels, television shows, and even comic books. But as is often the case, the reality is way more complex and way more interesting than the fiction. Today we're going to take a look at what life was really like as a samurai in feudal Japan. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel. After that, we'd be much obliged if you would leave a comment and let us know what topics you would like to hear about. Okay, let's head back to feudal Japan. The word samurai is derived from the Japanese word subaru, which means to serve. Both the word and the warrior class that it describes came into being around the 8th century, or what's known as Japan's Heian period. For comparison, this was roughly the same time knights were going on crusades over in Europe. The role evolved over the years, and by the 12th century, the samurai would begin to resemble the cultured, disciplined warrior that is familiar to us today. Prior to the Heian period, Japan's imperial court built their military by drafting inexperienced and generally unreliable peasants. At the same time, the country's nobility were employing highly trained private soldiers. By the end of the 8th century, the government began to integrate these elite warriors in the nation's military establishment. These men were the first samurai. The birth of the samurai order changed everything. The military was quickly replaced with what were, for all intents and purposes, professional mercenaries. This made enlistment popular with elites and lower aristocrats seeking employment and valuable training. These changes also meant that noble families had increasing influence over military policy, which, as you might imagine, they were pretty happy about. In the mid-12th century, the Minamoto clan defeated the Taira clan in the Genpei War of 1180. The fallout of this victory was enormous. The government became a military dictatorship under the command of Minamoto Yoritomo, the first shogun. His reign would usher in what is now known as the Kamakura period of Japanese history. The shogun dispersed networks of loyal samurai throughout the country. They served as royal vassals who maintained order in the provinces and ran local governments on the shogun's behalf. This tightening of military control would continue into the 13th century when the invasions of Mongol Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, forced the whole country to band together under the shogun. If you were going to be a samurai, you needed to start young. How young? Well, one famous spiritual guide from the medieval era recommended encouraging bravery from the time of infancy. Children who were part of the samurai class could start learning the basics of fencing with wooden swords as early as 3 years old. Yeah, you heard that right. 3. And while modern society requires you to be 18 to see an R-rated movie, medieval samurai kids would be fighting with real, lethal blades by the time they were 5. In any case, training was underway before the age of 10, and boys would often be sent to special schools where they studied the samurai philosophies of spirituality, literature, weaponry, and conflict. Samurai were bound to maintain loyalty to the shogun and to the daimyo, who were the feudal warlords that ruled the various regions of Japan. These daimyo were supposed to rule their territories with wisdom and benevolence, but as you probably guessed, things didn't always go that way. In reality, many daimyo were corrupt, power-hungry, and determined to expand their regions through any means necessary. This often made life as a samurai a bit challenging. Being honor-bound to carry out the orders of a malevolent lord could take its toll on a samurai's good name. Over time, the samurai class as a whole earned a reputation for lawless, vicious behavior. Samurai were powerful and respected, but technically, they were not nobility. Under medieval Japan's rigid caste system, the samurai were part of a special military class that was treated more like merchants. This meant they faced many of the same financial challenges as merchants, and steady employment could be hard to come by. Complicating life for a samurai was that different shoguns would enact different rules governing their status. For example, one shogun defined samurai as an elite body, which sounds pretty cool until you realize it was just a way to extend the limits of his power over them. This kind of proclamation could make it more difficult to earn a living without putting a single extra cent into a samurai's pocket. While Zen Buddhism didn't arrive until the 12th century, Japan had known of Buddhism in general since the 6th century. With heavy restrictions on the cultivation of birds and animals for food, the religion led the country to embrace a diet heavy in fruits, vegetables, and grains, especially rice. As noted previously, samurai often struggled economically. This, in addition to their strict moral code, made them frugal eaters. While the aristocracy and the military elite dined at banquets that served the finest food and drinks, the samurai, like the peasants, relied on husked rice as a staple. This rice was supposed to be provided as rations by their respective lords. If expecting to go into battle, a samurai might supplement their diet with abalone, chestnuts, and kelp. When it came to beverages, samurai were allowed to partake in Japan's most widely consumed alcoholic beverage, the rice wine known as sake. Hey, if you had to lay down your life for your boss without hesitation, you might want a stiff drink too. Samurai were expected to be up at 4 a.m. for the rigid and exhausting training regimens, and then, if they weren't in battle or otherwise seeing action, they were required to spend their time studying. Being a skilled warrior in feudal Japan required expert-level knowledge of martial arts and weaponry. Samurai always fought with blades of various types, but their arsenals still evolved over time. Early samurai preferred fighting with spears. Medieval samurai, who mostly traveled on horseback, were partial to bows and arrows. The famous samurai sword, called a katana, became popular during the Kamakura period. Along with the bow, it would remain the samurai's predominant tool well into the 15th century. But studying wasn't just about becoming deadlier. It was believed that the stability and patience required for successfully learning the martial arts would improve one's sense of composure. Whether or not it really worked is anyone's guess, since records show that samurai were often, shall we say, less than composed when dealing with the peasantry. Going all the way back to the Heian period, samurai armor was extremely flexible. Iron plated with leather or strips of bronze were finely crafted by artisans using advanced tools. As technology continued to develop and new resources became available, samurai armor evolved with it. Over time, the armor became increasingly more elaborate, which had the side effect of increasing its weight. One type of armor, called the yori or oyori, consisted of a multi-part skirt, a cuirass, shoulder pads, and a helmet. Altogether, it weighed over 60 pounds. Those samurai helmets, called kabuto, were made from iron and steel. They covered the head and had flaps that provided for protection of the neck. The helmets were carefully sculpted and highly decorated. A daimyo warlord, for example, might wear some sort of animal iconography. Apparently, branding has always been important. If a samurai sought to wed, they needed the approval of someone who was the same or higher social rank than the person they wanted to marry. For samurai of higher ranks, marriages had to be arranged, and those of lower ranks often had arranged marriages as a formality. Marriages were usually arranged within the samurai class, although the lowest ranking members were allowed to marry commoners. While women had vast freedoms and rights during the early days of the samurai, the society grew more patriarchal over time. By the 13th century, the husbands had control over their households and their wives. Divorce was permitted, and having a second or even third marriage was not unusual. Tales of medieval samurai were passed down orally and eventually transcribed into epics. Such narratives were often characterized by long, detailed descriptions of military engagements and the samurai who fought in them. Warriors with concerns about combat or their own military service often looked to such tales for wisdom and guidance. The samurai also appeared in Japanese mythology. For example, one myth often retold by kabuki and no theaters tells of a famous general called Yoshitsune. His brother, the shogun, became violently jealous of his reputation, forcing the general to flee. In the 12th century, Zen Buddhism arrived in Japan. The religion, which requires adherents maintain a strict regimen of meditation, made a perfect complement to the lives of restraint and control enjoyed by the samurai. Zen Buddhist meditation also required great physical endurance. This appealed to the samurai because they loved to test the limits of their own strength. But perhaps most important was what Zen Buddhism offered the samurai philosophically. The samurai lived lives of immense danger. As the famous author from Japan's Tokugawa period observed, a samurai's chief business is to keep constantly in mind, by day and by night, the fact that he has to perish. Zen Buddhism and its indifference to the circle of life gave samurai the metaphysical framework to face their mortality and be effective as warriors. Over time, the samurai began to develop the famous moral code that would someday become known as Bushido, or the way of the warrior. A samurai's loyalty was to his daimyo and to the shogun, but the code governed his actions. Bushido required its adherents to be brave and honorable in battle, but also in everyday life. This code was standardized under the Kamakura shogunate in 1232 in a document called the Formulary of Adjudications. While they were often ignored in many regions of Japan, there were still consequences for samurai who acted without honor. The most severe of these consequences was seppuku, a formalized way of committing suicide that was seen as a way to reclaim one's lost honor. Seppuku could be imposed as a punishment for dishonorable behavior, and in wartime was often considered an honorable way to escape the shame of capture. Over the course of the Kamakura period of Japan's history, samurai philosophy grew to encompass matters beyond those directly related to battle and honor. Reflecting this expansion, warrior training came to include practice in literature and the arts. This aspect of samurai life was so important, one famous epic eulogized a particular warrior's death by describing him as preeminent in the arts of both sword and poetry. The artistic side of samurai life was captured in the phrase bunbu ryodo, which translates to literary arts, military arts, both ways. Or more informally, the pen and the sword in accord. The samurai were warrior poets whose lives could vary greatly depending on what era they lived in. Within any given period, their existence was shaped by circumstances like armed conflicts, economics, moral philosophy, class, and geographic location. Do you think you would have made it as a samurai in feudal Japan? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.